Iain Sinclair himself.
Yeah. This is a bit of an anticlimax after hearing all of these other people read my stuff so much better than I can. I think what was really beautiful today was that we happened to start with Einstein, because something very weird is happening with time. Partly a factor of being so old, but coming back to the same geography after this lacuna, this long year in which we all engaged in this magic form, feels very strange. It feels like I'm actually doing the thing for the first time, and suddenly grown up around are all these voices doing such wonderful work. And it reminded me of a particular salvage of some years back. We were being buried at home. I lived in the same little terraced house in Hackney for a very long time. And the books had grown and the papers had grown, and I was sort of made a joking remark in an interview. Someone said, "What on earth are you going to do with all this?" I said, "Oh, we're going one day it'll all go away to Texas." And a book dealer who I knew, rather like the one in the story that we heard, rang me up and said, "Well, did you mean it?" And I said, "Of course, yes." He said, "Well, okay, I'll do the deal for you." And so all this stuff, all this rubbish of mine, essentially, was boxed up and described, and it went off to Texas. So it was this huge salvage, literally a life of things I'd forgotten. And then I realized that a vital notebook I needed to get something was there. And luckily I was invited to go along and look at this stuff once it had been installed in this pristine environment in Austin, Texas. Everything is beautifully boxed. When it goes there, it goes into a killing room for several weeks, so that all the insects, the English insects, dangerous things, can all be killed. Some of them are put in bottles if they're really peculiar. And I found this notebook. They got me the notebook. I opened it up. And here we are on this gleaming glass surface, and all these immaculate American women with long nails painted, looking at this stuff. And I opened it up, and a whole pile of coal dust fell out of the table, because it had come as a working notebook from when I was working in Chobham Farm, unloading containers. And I realized that my life was salvaged. And then I was shown these boxes, and they were all like so-and-so, 1939 to 1982. Just everybody was birth date. I saw my own. There was birth date, line. And they were all looking at me, kind of waiting to fill in. Let's, for God's sake, get this salvage done and put the end date in. Salvage is a dangerous thing. And what's happened here, as I go to Einstein, is that I think everything has happened in reverse. Here is this sort of beautiful book. It's not salvaged, it was always there. And things that ran into it were the kind of necessary rituals that had to be gone through in this period of human lockdown. Because I found phenomenal energy and inspiration in seeing how this group on the screen formed and fired off each other. And to hear now people working on each other's poems and turning them into new poems in the way that Stephen did with this thing of mine. Wonderful, a really, really special experience. So I'm stepping away as if making a fresh start. And going backwards in time, I'll soon become one of those book dealers again. Most of the ones in that book are played down versions of what the real things are, but they're all dead. Now that academic life has gone, I'm going to have to start kind of getting back to the proper work of salvage all over again. And I think of a poet, Jeremy Prynne, gave a wonderful kind of impromptu talk on Charles Olson's poems, Maximus poems, this huge, sprawling collection of life's work. And how he described it was the process we've gone through. But this needs to start in a very detailed gathering up of research, facts, all the information about shipping, who founded this place, when did they come, what's happening in the newspapers, what buildings are being torn. There's this huge mass of information. But as life goes on and as time presses on this poet, he shreds it down and down and down until at the end you come through into these sort of almost Homeric lyrics. You get to the lyric condition, through having passed through this other stuff, dealing with objects and things. And I've felt that process happening in lots of things I was listening to now. But there's a complicated process behind it, that you end up with this purity of a kind of singing voice. And what Prynne said of Olson is that after coming through this process, looking west across America into the way space opens up, but it's dangerous, and equally out into the oceans of the world, where the underground mountains under the sea, you arrive at something. He said the curvature of the universe is love. And I think that's what we've got here, from the curvature of the work that you've all done, is arriving at a condition that the book is a unity. It's a special unity that's emerged from all of the little things that have gone together, that started off in so many fragmentary ways. I'm so pleased with that, because in the earlier versions, the voices were separate. They were all doing proper individual work, and it was a sort of melding together. Trevor was very much part of that, in making a shape of it, making a kind of novel of what had gone on. This time, it all seemed to happen of its own accord. I know the three editors have done a lot of work very nicely. I've only glanced at it. It seems something special. So I'm just going to read one little bit from the book that's been mentioned already, The Gold Machine, because this is a work of salvage. What happens is that there's my great-grandfather is a Scotsman who left school at 10. He lived on the inland from Aberdeen in northeast Scotland. They were pushed off the land. As a very young man, he goes off onto the oceans of the world to become a planter. I'm not going to go through that whole story, but as quite an elderly guy, he goes off on this expedition to Peru, to the headwaters of the Amazon, to look at and survey this territory. And he wrote about it and published a book in 1895. And I grew up with that book, and I read it as an adventure story. It was an amazing story. All kinds of things happened, particularly climaxing on a journey down the Rio Pirene. And at that time, these were the first sort of European figures who'd done any kind of account of this territory, because the Peruvians, the Hispanic Peruvians themselves, had no interest in it. And they'd essentially given the rights away after the war of the Pacific between Chile and Peru. They were in debt to the bankers in the city of London, and they said, you want to do something with this, do it. So these three people went, and they didn't really expect to come back. It was pretty hairy, and I grew up with that account. And I wanted to follow the journey of this book, because the voice in the book, his type of writing, was very like my own. And it comes to a climax where they go out on the river on balsa rafts that have been made by a group of the indigenous people, the Ashaninka, and they travel with them beyond their knowledge 40 miles down this river till they reach some impossible rapids, at which point all of the guides, the priests who are guiding them, and the Ashaninka themselves all disappear, and these three men are kind of abandoned in a clearing on the edge of the jungle, surrounded, and they think they're going to die that night. And I wanted, in my trip, to go through the rapids, the one thing he didn't do. And I felt, in a sort of shamanic sense, that I would make contact with the dead, beyond, if you could get through this point. And it was a sort of amazing adventure for ourselves when we got there. There was somebody who was going to take us on the river, but he didn't appear. We couldn't go. They were going to give it up, and I found a boy with a dugout canoe and persuaded him to take us, and we got to rapids. And then I heard that beyond the rapids was a whirlpool, and it was known as the whirlpool of dead ancestors. And everybody told us, you can't go beyond that, because the particular stretch beyond that was full of people doing cocaine business in the jungle, remnants of Shining Path, and it's dangerous on that level, and it's dangerous on the psychic level, and you're never going to get through the whirlpool of dead ancestors. So the thing was frustrated. I couldn't do this. Couldn't actually do the thing that I needed to do to finish the book. And instead of that, we went to the last The result of the survey, I should say, that went on, thanks to my daughter, who became obsessed with this story when she was 18. She read the book and she went off to Peru on her own. And she did the real work and discovered that these people were doing a survey for the Peruvian Corporation of London to see if you could grow coffee. So there had been a whole series of coffee plantations put in this territory, and the indigenous people felt that they were being enslaved. And it was a really pretty terrible story. They weren't treated as badly as the rubber plantations, but it was bad enough. There's one surviving coffee plantation now. So this was basically the end of our trip. And I didn't know how it was going to resolve. But the coffee plantation as it exists now is a cooperative. It's not to do with the Peruvian Corporation of London, removed. It's a cooperative. They're carrying on the work. And what we discovered, because my daughter brought copies of the contracts with the Peruvian Corporation, which they knew nothing about, and showed it to them. And they were so grateful, they led us to show us something, which was the ultimate salvage. And it's as if the book had unpacked itself in reverse, as I was talking about. This was a locked room, it was a caged room, which had all of the written records of every transaction from that coffee plantation back to the dog. And all of it was just like potential books, hundreds of books. My book, everybody's book was in there, but it was being eaten by rats. It was just piled up in sacks. It was a mad, mad thing. I'll just read that little bit about that. And that's kind of rounds off our whole project. And I was writing this the same time as you were doing the book. In the later stages of the armed struggle, disaffected Maoists followed the money into illicit coca cultivation and processing. According to Michael F. Brown, a climate of lawlessness was created in the cloud jungle, in which the insurgents thrived by aligning themselves with peasant farmers and against Peruvian paramilitaries and police. They associated uniformed militias with protection offered to the large coffee estates. Those grey columns set among skeletal ruins were the residue of a resisted Shining Path assault on Pampahueli. But the guerrillas did not reach the heart of the operation, the cave of paper. Out of nowhere, at the end of our tour, we were treated to the ultimate revelation, the surviving archive of the Pampahueli plantation, correspondence with the Peruvian Corporation of London, all of it. Don Armando was slightly reluctant, ushering us into the chamber, stepping quickly aside from an aura of non-specific shame, like a man with a collection of stolen paintings in his garage, masterpieces that he could neither restore nor sell off. The Lima records have been burnt or shredded, so that official accounts do not contradict the version of progress, of exploration and road building promoted by Peruvian diplomats like Senor F.A. Pezet. This insane lumber room of pre-bonfire documentation is everything there now is. It is in essence the whole world of the plantation, a mausoleum of fiscal fingerprints and triple entry bookkeeping, tangible evidence for any future prosecution, the tattered confessions of pioneer planters. Here was a pitiful fence of numbers erected against the evil fecundity of the forest. It was easier to keep everything and to ignore it, to hide it away, and to make cosmetic changes to a system of coercive slavery and exploitation. Swollen safes had burst, heavy metal rotted by tropical rains and the lustful heat of languid and drunken afternoons. Coffee sacks could not contain the papers with which they had been stuffed. Bugs feasted on ink and cardboard. Rats gnawed new trails across fabulous hand-drawn treasure maps. Every coin paid out was recorded. Every complaint was registered. This was a Peruvian version of a Stasi surveillance bunker, unpillaged and unexamined. I noted a straining shelf loaded with box files, I photographed charts of the Pyrenees, the reaches beyond the rapids. You could lie down, sleep on mattresses of unpaid bills and buried invoices, and never wake into the same reality. There were even bundles of books, paperback and antiquarian, novels and manuals of instruction, glued into blocks by the liquors of entropy. Forensic teams could disappear into this cage and emerge decades later with a comprehensive record covering every last aspect of the rise and fall and resurrection of the Pampa Whaley plantation. Such a wealth of facts, a cave of paper, heavier than the legendary gold of Juan Santos Atahualpa, was open to interpretation from all parts of the cultural spectrum. I was dizzy, I was choked on sentient dust. In this barred cell was the explosion of my project. All of the words, false starts, digressions, dictated runs and rushes, all the libraries I'd asset stripped, all the books and maps and photographs stacked so menacingly around my desk. Here was a conceptual exhibition, spearing my vanities. I saw my proposed book gutted and spilled and broken down into its constituent parts, while I indulged the unexpected gift of this archival metaphor, while I jumped about, gleaning for the most potent images to carry away. My daughter was reading. She was assessing and evaluating. She found a bunch of papers among so many to be photocopied and we returned to the company office. There was a filmmaker with us called Grant G, I should say. There was no going back. My correspondent with moral conscience, the Spanish lawyer battling in Brussels with plague and endlessly revised treaties, said that my photographs from the Pampa Whaley archive, although terrifying in their call for action, were nothing on the computer files with which he was assaulted day after day. And that is why he made it his business to emphasize by messenger, letter, fax, and telepathy that when there's no other place to go and no way of getting there, the writer must intensify to the ultimate degree the place he or she is fortunate enough to occupy. You start with a few yards of ground, the length of your own shadow. My friend in Brussels referred me to the split vision of the poet Ed Dawn in the closing book of his definitive quest narrative of the American West, Gunslinger. A journey to nowhere that arrives many times over.